everybody, and welcome back to another interesting episode of Crazy Tech Reviews. Now, first of all, before we get into this, I'd like to just clarify, no, I am not dead. I apologize for the lack of episodes on this channel over the past 4 or 5 months. With school and everything starting up, it's been really hard to keep up with the channel, but I'm trying my best, and I'm trying to get as many videos out as I possibly can. Anyway, though, with that out of the way, I'd like to get into what we're going to be doing in today's video. Now, as you can see here by looking at the workbench, I have all 3 of my vintage compact Macs out here sitting, and that is because in today's video, we're going to be talking about something that I've been wanting to talk about for several months now, and basically what that is over the years of collecting vintage compact Macs, I've learned quite a bit about sort of how they work and some basic things that you sort of need to know in order to be able to maintain and or use these vintage Macs. So I figured that in today's video, given that a lot more people are starting to get into collecting vintage computers, I'd go ahead and take a shot at trying to give you guys some basic tips and some basic things to be aware of when getting into collecting vintage Macs, and more specifically vintage compact Macs. Now, I'm not going to be doing this video alone. As a matter of fact, I'm actually going to be doing this alongside Arno the iAppleGuy and Enzo from the YouTube channel Enzo NoLastName, and we've all decided to do a big collab project here for today's video. So I hope you guys enjoy it. And with that said, let's go ahead and get right into this. Anyway, though, before we get started, I'd like to quickly say something here real quick, and that is that I would like to go ahead and apologize ahead of time if there are any holes or missing things or just anything like that that you might notice in this video, or anything that you thought should have been mentioned that wasn't. It has been kind of difficult working with 3 different people, across the world in some cases, trying to get this all organized, get the script written, and make sure that everything stays on topic. So we've tried our best, and I think, personally, this video turned out very good myself, so I hope you guys think the same. With that said, if there is anything that you think is really important that you notice is missing from this video, please be sure to let me know either in an email or Discord message, or even just in the comment section below if you can, as I would really appreciate it. That way I can possibly make changes in the future to this and re-upload it maybe with whatever you thought should have been in there. But anyway, with that said, with that long message aside, let's go ahead and get right into this video. So before we get started, I figured I'd go ahead and give a brief history on the compact Mac line. The original Macintosh was released in 1984 and was the successor to one of Apple's biggest failures, the Apple Lisa, released a year prior. The original Macintosh carried over some of the Lisa's unique features, such as the GUI, but also compressed them into a small and lightweight and somewhat portable form factor with a carry handle on the top that could be used to carry the machine around with you if you please. The original Macintosh came with 128K of RAM and a 400K 3.5-inch floppy drive, which most computers during this time were still using the older 5 1/4-inch discs instead, and haven't yet adopted the new standard. And on paper, 128K of RAM was still pretty impressive for 1984. However, due to the fact that the Macintosh was way more advanced than many other machines during this time period, 128K of RAM was actually pretty limited, and unfortunately, due to the size of the machine, it wasn't really possible to upgrade the memory, or at least upgrade it easily either. So later that year, they released the Macintosh 512K, which had a lot more memory by default. Other than the RAM boost, though, the 512K is basically the same machine as the 128K, with the only real difference being, other than the RAM, the badge on the back of the computer. A few years later, in 1986, Apple released the Macintosh Plus, which came with 1 MB of RAM by default and used the new Sony 800K double-density floppy disk drives. However, the main feature of the Plus was that it comes with upgradable memory that can be upgraded in the form of 4 SIMs located on the main logic board. Shortly after the Macintosh Plus was released, Apple moved to an even more expandable design with the release of the Macintosh SE in 1987. The machine featured a built-in PDS slot and a motherboard that can be used for all kinds of useful expansions, from processor upgrades to even Ethernet or video cards. The SE also featured a new case design, which included a cooling fan and even an optional hard drive if you wanted to pay extra for it. The SE was also one of the only Mac models to be made with both 800K and 1.44 MB floppy drives, which we'll talk more about later in the episode. In 1989, Apple introduced the Macintosh SE30, The Macintosh SC30 is commonly referred to as one of the most powerful compact Macs ever made, as it could support not only up to 128 megabytes of RAM, but also has a 1.44 megabyte floppy drive and a 68030 processor in it. So yes, it's definitely one of the more powerful compact Mac models ever made. And then finally, a year later in 1990, Apple introduced the Macintosh Classic. The Classic was intended to be a low-cost Macintosh model for somebody who didn't want to go all out for something like a 2CI or something. The Classic was sold alongside the LC and the 2SI machines, which are also low-cost machines. However, the Classics are notorious for being unreliable, and they have all kinds of issues that we'll get into later. And then finally, just a year after the original Classic, in 1991, the Classic 2 was released. And the Classic 2 kept many of the same features as the original Classic, except for the fact that it has built-in RAM sims on the motherboard, and it was slightly more powerful than the original Mac Classic. So anyway, now that you guys have a basic introduction to vintage compact Macs, I'd like to get into a little bit on how you can find your own. I mean, after all, this video is about getting into collecting these vintage computers, so I figured it would only be perfect that we talk a bit about how you're going to find your own machine, as by this point in time, these machines are starting to become more and more collectible and more difficult to find. So, with that said, I'd like to welcome the iAppleGuy onto the show, who is going to talk a bit about this.
Hello, I'm the iAppleGuy. I'm located in Belgium, so finding vintage Macs here is a little harder. I believe that's because less people use or used Apple here. Not all people want to ship to Belgium. I do find stuff in the Netherlands a lot. Look for bargains, but don't spend beyond your means. eBay prices can be ridiculously high. Just take a look at the exceedingly overpriced vintage computer stuff for sale group on Facebook. Have patience and search around. The vintage computers, or in this case, vintage Macs, will start showing up for less money.
Also, once you do finally purchase your own vintage Macintosh, be sure to notify the seller to pack the item very well, because it seems to be a common trend these days that shipment carriers are not very kind with the items that go through them. So in order to eliminate any chances of ending up with a pile of smashed up plastic, be sure to notify the seller to pack the item as best as he or she can. So let's say that you found yourself a good deal on a compact Mac on eBay, and after waiting what felt like an eternity, but was really only a couple of days, you quickly rush to unbox your machine, only to realize that when you turn it on, something doesn't seem to be working. Unfortunately, since these computers are 30 years old and older in some cases, things will often go wrong with them, and most likely, unless you bought yours either in mint condition or restored by somebody else, you're most likely going to have to do some basic maintenance and repair steps in order to keep it operational, or to repair it if it isn't operational when you receive it. So I figured that in this section of the video, it's important that I sort of go over some of the common issues that you might run into with one of these vintage Macs, and how to properly troubleshoot and or fix it. Probably one of the most common issues that you will experience on pretty much every single model of vintage compact Macintoshes is dried up / malfunctioning floppy drives. Now usually these are pretty common, and most likely you will have to encounter one, and usually this is caused by built-up of dust and dried up grease from the machine sitting around in somebody's attic or basement for 30 years, and usually it's fairly easy to clean off and relubricate these drives. I will link some tutorials in the description, but yeah, it's usually pretty simple. Another common failure point with these 1.44 megabyte and 800K floppy drives is the ejector motors. Now basically, if we go ahead and take a look underneath this little metal plate here, and take a look at this nifty little gear reduction system here, I'd like to bring your attention over to the far right here and on this little gear. Now, as you can tell, it's a bit yellower than the others, and that's because it's actually a different composition of plastic that's a bit more soft than the rest. And the reason for this is, in the event that something were to jam up or get stuck over on this side of the mechanism, then this gear would shear off some teeth or something like that, therefore preventing the motor from burning out, and probably saving a lot of money, as most likely in that case you would have to end up replacing the entire mechanism instead of just a cheap little gear. However, unfortunately, over the years, these gears have become very brittle, and as you can see with this one in specific, it's literally about as soft as Swiss cheese. As you can see here, when I just press my screwdriver down on it a little bit, pieces of plastic just start shooting all across the room. But yeah, basically, Fortunately, you can still find modern replacements of these that are 3D printed, and these are a very good investment if you plan on using your floppy drives a lot, and I actually fortunately have a few of these. This is one of them here. As you can see, these are very high quality prints too. But basically, in order to install one of these, all you really have to do is simply remove the gear that's on top of the old gear, as well as the gear you want to replace, which is the yellow one usually, to the far right. And then go ahead and insert the new 3D printer replacement here, and then go ahead and put this gear back on top of it. And that's pretty much all you have to do besides reinstalling the metal plate. Now, if you have a 400K drive like this in your Mac, you don't really have to worry about this, as the ejector mechanisms on these are built completely different from the ones in the 800K drives, and I do not believe they use gears like that. So, if you have one of these, then you at least don't have to worry about this. So anyway, with that said, that's pretty much all that you'll really have to generally do when servicing these 1.44 megabyte and 800K floppy drives. There are a few other things I'd like to talk about real quick, and the first one of those is cleaning the read heads. Now, usually cleaning the read heads on one of these floppy drives, or for that matter, any floppy drive you'll have to deal with, is very easy. Really, all you have to do is find either a disk cleaning disk. However, I would advise not using that on the 400K drives due to the fact that they are only single-sided, and therefore you have to risk damaging the felt tip that presses down against the disk. So really, you'd only use that for 800K drives and 1.44 megabyte drives that are double-sided. However, you can also just take a normal Q-tip with isopropyl alcohol on it and just simply scrub down the surface, although you do want to be careful that you don't bend up the top read head too far. However, usually it's pretty easy, and it's very low risk that you'll actually end up damaging things as long as you are careful. I'd also like to say one more thing in regards to these VesperWorks 3D printed gears. While these will work most of the time, I would advise being careful with these, as in the event that your drive gets jammed up or something. I'm not really sure if these are designed to really fail in order to protect the eject mechanism, or if they would just if the motor would just not, like, yeah. But basically, just be careful with these, because until we get something that really mimics the physics of whatever plastic was used originally to make the original drive gears that would allow them to snap under force if the drive jams, then I would, yeah, just be careful of those. But anyway, with that said, it's time to move on to some other issues that you might have to deal with when repairing vintage Macintoshes and when collecting vintage Macintoshes. So let's go ahead and get right into those.
Any Mac made between the late 80s and mid to late 90s is likely to have leaky SMD or surface mount capacitors. This is a big problem, as over time, as the electrolyte sits on the board, it will slowly corrode and eat away at the traces, chip legs, and other components that it makes contact with.
The main reason for this is due to a miscopied formula used when manufacturing these caps that causes any electrolytic capacitor manufactured during this time frame to have a higher failure rate than normal, which means that you won't have any choice but to recap the boards or have somebody recap them for you. As a matter of fact, if you have the skill, I would recommend replacing the caps as soon as you receive the machine, just to be safe. There is a site that sells kits with the correct caps for your machine that I will link in the description for you as well if you need it.
On the other hand, if you have an earlier Mac from the Macintosh 128K or Macintosh SE SuperDrive era, you don't need to worry as much about caps as with 90s Macs. Or at least as far as the motherboard goes, as these machines have more reliable caps on the motherboard and analog board. As a matter of fact, on these models, it isn't really necessary to recap the motherboards. However, if you can, I would still recommend recapping the analog board if you have the parts and know-how, as some of the early Macs can have some cap issues on the analog board and power supply side of things. However, these problems usually aren't as serious as on later Macs from the 90s. Also, there are videos on both my channel and Crazy Tech Reviews channel on how to do this.
These Macs are also infamous for having leaky PRAM batteries. These batteries can also be called CMOS batteries or clock batteries, as their main purpose is to store the system time while the computer is not running, as well as some other settings like the mouse speed and things like that. On some later Macs, like the Macintosh 2, which I'm not covering really here, they are even required to start up the computer. However, that isn't the case with the primary focus of this video, the compact Mac machines. Over time, while the machine is sitting in somebody's basement or attic, these batteries can leak, and in that case, if it's not caught soon enough, you have the possibility of a damaged logic board, similar to what would happen with electrolytic caps if they are left sitting on the board for a while and corrode the traces, except on a much worse scale, as with leaky batteries, it does not take as long for them to completely destroy large sections of your motherboard and possibly other important metal shielding and brackets nearby. So the first thing I would do, even before recapping any vintage Mac, even the ones that aren't affected by cap leakage, is to remove that battery. It only takes a few minutes or even seconds depending on your model, and could save you hours or days or even a few $100s in the event that you can't repair it if it is damaged by battery acid. So by this point in the video, we've already talked about some of the major issues that you'll experience when having to deal with a vintage Mac, such as a compact Mac like these machines, or even another vintage Mac that's not particularly in this specific line of products. However, there is one major thing I'd also like to cover that's probably the most noticeable when you pick up your vintage Mac, and it's probably the only thing that's also optional on this list, although if you have the skill and you want to, I would suggest doing it, and that is retrobriting your plastics. Now, most of the plastics on these vintage Macs, as you can tell by this SE here, for example, this classic has already been retrobrited, not by me, but by somebody else, but you can see that the plastics have yellowed.
This yellowing is caused by a fire retardant called bromine in these ABS plastics.
Now, this isn't a process I really understand very well, but from what I gather, basically what happens is when the computer is sitting next to a window and exposed to a lot of UV light, or sitting in an attic or something and exposed to a lot of heat, or sometimes both at the same time, either of these would react to the bromide of the plastic, therefore causing the machine to yellow.
This yellowing can be reversed using retrobrite. Now, retrobrite is basically bleaching the plastic until it returns back to its original color.
Here's an example of a successful retrobrite job. Retrobrite can be done with hydrogen peroxide and UV light.
Although there are different ways one can retrobrite, such as using a hydrogen peroxide based cream and plastic wrap, and instead of using the sun's UV light, using artificial UV lighting. I mean, the list goes on. You also have light brightening and painting, but I'm not really sure if those fall into the category retrobriting, but probably.
Not only can Macs become yellow, but their plastic can also become really brittle after many years. This isn't as common with the compact Macs this video mainly focuses on, but it is very common in some later Apple Macs from the 90s. The PowerBook 100 series of Apple laptops is one of the worst examples of this, as many have become incredibly brittle over the years. Some other machines that are pretty badly affected by brittle plastics are the LC500 All-in-One series of Macs, as the clips that hold certain parts in become brittle over time. And that is certainly another reason why you should have your vintage computers packed very well. So with that said, those are most of the relatively common issues that you'll run into with a vintage compact Mac or just vintage Mac in general. Now, the thing you gotta keep in mind is, well, it might have sounded like a long list of problems. These computers are, in some cases, over 30 years old, and it's very likely you will run into some of them, so I figured it's better I just go ahead and just show you guys what some of the possibilities are so that you are already prepared when getting one of these to possibly face some of these issues. Now, fortunately, unless you're getting something like a Macintosh Classic, you will not have to necessarily worry about recapping the machines, as Arno mentioned earlier in the video. However, I would still advise it if you want to. Anyway, though, with that said, now that you've gotten your machine up and working, or if you're lucky, yours already came up and working, let's move on to the next section of this video, which is actually getting an operating system on these and getting software onto these. And for that, I'd like to invite Enzo onto the show, who is going to talk a bit about that. But before we move on to that, I'd like to mention one thing that's pretty important that I forgot to mention earlier, and that's that these machines here, since obviously these Macs were released a long time before LCDs saw any mainstream use in personal computers, these machines come built in with 9-inch black and white CRTs, or cathode ray tubes. Now, the issue with this is that since these tubes require high amounts of electricity to function correctly, you will need to know how to properly discharge the anodes in these CRTs. Now, fortunately, this is a very simple process, and I will actually, since I'm not going to get too in-depth on anything really in this specific video, I will go ahead and link a video done by Bruce Rain of the YouTube channel Brankus Creations, in which he demonstrates how to properly discharge a cathode ray tube that you would find inside something like a Mac like this. Anyway, with that said, I guess we'll go ahead and move on to the next topic.
Hello there, my name's Enzo, and I'm from the YouTube channel Enzo's No Last Name. I'm going to be doing a cameo for this video, and I'm going to be talking about getting old software on your Mac. How do you do it? Now, this is going to be a very simplified, and there's a lot of things I'm going to have to leave out because this part would become 15 minutes long, and Logan got angry because my previous clip got 15 minutes long. Let's start off with getting software on your old Mac, since that's the simplest of the tasks. Now, getting software on your old Macs, specifically the compact Macs as Logan wants me to talk about, is pretty easy depending on what floppy drive you have. If you have a 800 and 400K drive, that's a little complicated.
Unfortunately, though, most of the earlier Macintosh models, such as the Macintosh 128K, 512K, 512KE Plus, and some of the earlier SE models come with 800K and 400K drives built in, which means that you can't just simply use a standard old USB floppy drive and some software on your PC to write disks for them. Instead, you will have to have a machine with a 1.44MB floppy drive, such as an SC FDHD, SE30, Macintosh Classic or Classic 2, or any other of the other Macintosh models that come with 1.44MB floppy drives, which are pretty much all of them other than the few that come with 400 and 800K drives. However, as far as the compact Macs, these are the only ones that come with 1.44MB drives built in.
And this is one of the main reasons why I don't usually recommend vintage Macs like the Macintosh Plus or earlier, and that's because you're pretty much going to need something like a Macintosh SCFDHD or later to write disks for this machine. However, there are some other options for getting software onto older Macs, such as the Macintosh Plus, for example.
A relatively common alternative to traditional floppy disks as far as file transfers go are zip disks. Now, these function in pretty much the exact same way as a traditional floppy drive, except given the right hardware and software, you can write to these on a modern computer and have them be readable on an old Mac. These also store a lot more than traditional floppy disks. This one in particular stores 100 megabytes, which is more than even a traditional SCSI hard drive like this Quantum Pro drive here that was found in a Mac Classic would even store, as this one stores only 40 megabytes, which makes these also a very popular alternative for hard drives as well in the case that your hard drive doesn't work or that you want to use it instead, as hard drives can be unreliable for these older computers given their age. As far as purchasing an old SCSI zip drive goes, you won't have to usually pay too much for them. Usually they sell anywhere from $20 to $60, which is very reasonable for Mac stuff. However, one thing I'd like you to be aware of is that there are two different standards of zip drives. The SCSI or Small Computer System Interface standard are the drives that were mainly used with the Macintosh machines. Parallel, on the other hand, is an interface that was mainly used with PCs and PC compatibles, and most likely using a parallel zip drive with your Macintosh would end up frying your SCSI controller. Most eBay sellers will tell you what interface the drive is in the listings. However, you do want to be careful if you see something like this where they list both, as this is not possible. Most likely the seller is getting confused by the fact that both the SCSI and parallel zip drives pretty much use the exact same connectors. However, usually you should be able to separate them pretty easily, depending on the fact that most SCSI zip drives, if not all of them, you have the SCSI symbol above the port, which obviously signifies that it's a SCSI drive, and just in case you aren't aware, this is what the SCSI logo looks like. And another option if you have an 800K disk drive in your machine and you need to get software onto it is just to buy the disks from somebody else. RescueMyClassicMac.com is a relatively good site for this, and I have bought both my boot disks and even some other disks off of him before. Plus, you can also even send in your own images to have put onto a disk. However, this does add up really quick, and it's probably easier just to use one of the previous options or find a machine with a 1.44MB floppy drive that you can use as a file transfer machine to your compact Mac.
So anyway, with that said, now that I've talked about some other alternatives if you do end up purchasing a machine such as this Macintosh Plus here, or any other machine that has an 800 or 400K floppy drive, I figure it's time I'll show you how to copy files from a modern PC and put them on one of these vintage Macs. Starting, of course, with the easier of these two machines to transfer files to, and that is the Macintoshes that use the 1.44MB drives, and I will show you, therefore, how to get files from a 1.44MB machine to an 800K machine. Because if you plan on using floppies to transfer files from your modern PC to something like an older 800K or 400K floppy drive machine, then you will actually need a machine that has a 1.44 megabyte drive, as I mentioned in previous parts of this video. But anyway, that said, the process itself isn't actually too complicated, and it should be fairly easy to understand, so let's go ahead and get right into this.
The first thing you will need to do in order to transfer games, software, or operating systems onto your vintage Mac is to download the software you want to put on your Mac. There are two main Macintosh archive sites that I usually recommend for this, and those are the Macintosh Repository and the Macintosh Garden. In this particular example, I will be using the Macintosh Repository as I am more used to its user interface and it's what I use more frequently. However, the Macintosh Garden is a very nice site as well. Go ahead and proceed to download whatever software or games that you want. However, in this case, since most likely it's the first thing you'll need to download, I'm going to be downloading an operating system. I found this pack of System 6 disk images here on the Macintosh Repository, and I will be using System 6.0.8 in particular, as it will run on the majority of compact Mac machines. As a matter of fact, the only compact Macs that won't work on are the Mac 128K and 512K. As far as what operating system I would recommend for those two machines, I would recommend either System 3 or 2, as they are compatible with those two computers. Anyway, now that you have downloaded whatever program or files that you've wanted to, most likely they will come in a stuffit or .sit archive file. This was a popular archiving format and still is for vintage Mac machines. However, unfortunately, most likely your modern PC, which is what this part of the video is mainly oriented to, will unfortunately probably not be able to natively read these files. To resolve this issue, you will need to download a version of Aladdin Expander 5.0 that I have linked in the description that will allow you to properly uncompress these zip files. Some other programs and games that you download might also come in zip files, or even just a bare DSK or disk image file. Both of these do not need any specific software to uncompress them or anything special like that. The next thing you'll need to do is download a free program called PowerISO. PowerISO is a program used for mounting and creating disk images, and it plays a very important role in transferring programs to vintage Macs with this method. There will also be download links to all the other programs mentioned in the section in the description below. By this point, you have likely uncompressed the stuffit files your program came in, or if it came in some other kind of compression format. Most likely, once you do that, you will find some files with the DSK extension after it's been uncompressed, or you might have just downloaded a single .dsk file. As I mentioned earlier, these are disk images, and what you might think is that you could just go straight into PowerISO and burn these disk images to a real floppy. However, the issue is that PowerISO does not support them natively, which means we will have to convert these images into a standard that PowerISO does understand. In order to do that, the first thing you will need to do is to go to the new button on the top left corner of PowerISO and click the little drop-down menu attached to it. Then go ahead and click the floppy disk image option. You should get a dialog box with the properties of the disk image. You can leave most of these alone for now, other than the image size drop-down, which you will need to select the standard 1.44 megabyte option on. Now all you have to do is save the disk image to your computer. Usually I name this after the Mac program. However, if the Mac program uses multiple floppies, I name it after whichever floppy it'll serve as. Now that you've created the disk image with a more traditional .image format, we will need to go ahead and download yet another program. This program is called MiniVMac. There are many good tutorials on how to set up MiniVMac, but we will go ahead and skip out on that for now. But basically, what it is a classic Macintosh emulator. Once you have it booted up, the first thing you'll need to do is either close out of PowerISO or create a new image. That way it doesn't claim that another program is using the disks that you will need to mount in MiniVMac. Anyway, what I'm going to do now is drag both the original DSK image I downloaded off the archive site and also the .img that we made in PowerISO. The DSK image should mount just fine. However, when you insert the img file, it might claim that it's unformatted and ask you to format it. This is because depending on what disk image you use for MiniVMac in order to boot it, which I'm not going to cover in this particular video, it most likely won't be able to read PC formatted disks since Mac disks are formatted differently after all. So this isn't an issue. So just proceed to click initialize and format the disk as a Macintosh disk. If the IMG disk does mount successfully, then you'll need to go ahead and reformat it, as this means that your Mac has a PC Exchange control panel allowing it to read PC formatted floppies, which includes the ones that we are emulating. Anyway, regardless of whether it prompts you to format the disk or not, be sure that you format it as a 1.44 megabyte Macintosh disk, as this will be necessary for your compact Mac to read it natively. Next, you can go ahead and proceed to copy all the files from the DSK image to the IMG disk. Then you can go ahead and eject both the disks from Mini VMac, and at this point you should be able to insert a high-density floppy disk, aka the ones with 2 holes on both the top corners, into your USB floppy drive or whatever floppy drive solution you have on your computer. Run a fresh format on the disk using the Windows Explorer, and then go to the Tools menu in Power ISO and select the right floppy disk image file option. Then all you have to do is simply select the image, the IMG disk image that we created earlier, and copy all the files over to. And in the case that you have a multi-disk program, you will just need to repeat this step with different floppies for each disk image that you have created earlier. And then by clicking the OK button, it will proceed to reformat the disk with the Macintosh image that we created of that disk. It will prompt you with this little error message here. However, you can just click OK, as this is just warning you that it will erase everything that's currently on the floppy disk. And once the progress bar completes, you should have a fresh Macintosh program on the disk.
Now, if you want to take the program or operating system that you made on this machine and transfer it over to something like an older 800K Mac or 400K Mac, this is where it starts to get even more complicated. And I apologize, I hope this section wasn't too complicated, but that's sort of the way it goes with stuff like these old computers and different file formats and stuff like that. And there are a lot of different ways to transfer files over to these and to, move programs back and forth between these machines, even as far as just through floppy disks. I mean, I can think of at least a good 3 or 4 different ways to do it, as far as transferring files from new computers to old Macs, or from, hell, even old Macs that can connect to the internet to other old Macs. So I hope that this doesn't get too confusing, but it's kind of hard to really simplify it down too much, as you sort of have to really understand sort of how the file formats and everything work, and with these old Macs, and sort of what you can and can't transfer back and forth between them, to really know how to do this. And there are also several other, probably more detailed tutorials on how to transfer files between Macs. So I'm trying to keep sort of the general concept of this video only focusing briefly on certain topics, and I think I got more in detail on this one than I wanted to. So I apologize if anybody's a little bit confused from this, as it is kind of a confusing topic that definitely took me a while to sort of get the hang of as well. So anyway, with that said, I will link some other tutorials. But anyway, back to the main topic here, as far as converting files from these 1.44 megabyte Macs to these older ones. First of all, you'll need to be able to boot up these systems, so most likely you'll end up having to either find or buy a boot disk. I forgot to mention that earlier, but you will need that, because I think some of these might be able to, but I know for sure that most of the, depending on the operating systems, most of these Macs are only able to format, or the software only lets you format for 1.44 megabyte disks, as obviously it's Apple trying to kill off older things. But anyway, once you have this machine booted up, it's simply as simple as sticking a fresh floppy to here, and then preferably you would use a double density floppy. However, if you don't have one of those, you can just simply put tape over one of the holes on a standard high density floppy. It would be the right hole, or the left hole if it's facing you. If the label's facing you, as this hole is the right protect, that doesn't matter. That way it will trick this machine into thinking it's a 1.44 megabyte floppy, or a 800K floppy, and then you'd want to format that disk in this as an 800K disk, or if it's an older 400K Mac, a 400K disk, and then you'd put it in this machine, obviously with the tape on it, so because otherwise it will say it's improperly formatted. You'd copy the files over, and then you'd boot it on here, or load it back into here. Anyway, though, this topic can get a little bit complicated. Apologize if anybody is a little bit confused. Again, but hopefully you get the basic idea of sort of how to do it. I would suggest checking out some more detailed, dedicated tutorials to that. But anyway, with that said, let's switch off of this topic and talk a bit about storing these Macs. So finally, after a little bit or a lot of work, you have finally got your first working vintage Macintosh. Now trust me, it might be your first, but it sure won't be your last Mac. At some point you will come across another model that interests you, and you will proceed to expand your collection. However, in order to do so, you will need somewhere that you can use or just store your vintage Macs, as they do take up a lot of space. For example, I have several shelves in my basement or YouTube studio that I keep most of my collection on, and also some upstairs in my room that I store Macs that I frequently use or want to display. I would say it's good that you have a dedicated room to mess around with and store your collection, as they pile up quickly if you don't.
Now, I don't really have a very big collection compared to some other collectors. I'm looking at you, Mac84, but I still need shelves to store my stuff on. I keep all of my cables, software, and overall small stuff in boxes. Now, I can't really display anything or put everything on tables because otherwise I wouldn't have enough room for other stuff, and honestly, this just looks better.
Anyway, though, unfortunately, that is going to do it for today's video. Now, in theory, there are many different things that I could talk about that have to do with getting into collecting vintage compact Macs. However, in this video, I mainly just wanted to cover some of the basic things that you will definitely need to know to at least sort of understand sort of getting into collecting these vintage computers. Now, obviously, since these are computers and they are 30 years old, some of the stuff is going to be a little bit complicated. For example, the whole file transfer thing. And that's sort of just something you have to go in understanding, and that's that these aren't going to be always simple and easy to get working and to use. But overall, I have to say that collecting vintage Macs has been a very fun experience for me personally, and I really enjoy getting to mess around with some of these cool old machines. But with that said, I hope that this video, if it didn't give you some basic understanding of sort of getting into these machines, at least sort of open your eyes up to sort of what it's like to own these and sort of some things that you need to understand about them. Anyway, though, that said, since as of the time I'm filming this, it is the day before Christmas, I'd like to go ahead and wish everybody a happy holidays, whichever one you celebrate, and in case I don't get any videos out before the new year, then also happy new year. However, I do plan on getting at least one more video out before then. Anyway, though, with that said, there are some things to be looking forward to as far as the channel goes. I know it hasn't been very active recently, but I do apologize for that. I do have a few videos that are coming up very shortly. For one, there's one that I hope to get out before the new year, and that is in which I will be going thrifting and finding some cool vintage gaming and computer goodies. So that should be out in a few days. And to start off the new year, I will also be doing a video in which we repair this Macintosh LC I got recently. However, I'm not really going to spoil too much of those, so you'll just have to wait for those to come out to see what happens in both of those videos. But anyway, with that said, I'd like to thank you guys all for sticking to the end of this video, and I'd also like to thank you guys for subscribing to this channel. This channel has grown exponentially this year, and I can't thank you guys enough for all the views and subscribers that we have gained this year on this channel. And also, of course, before we end this, I'd like to give a special thanks to Arno, the iAppleGuy, Enzo from the YouTube channel Enzo NoLastName, and also Scarlet Swordfish from the MacYak Discord server, who supplied me with lots of Mac and 128K and 512K B-roll. So big thanks to all you guys for making this video possible, and I hope to see all you guys sometime in the future.